So yeah, even on a heavy overcast day like today, this pool just amazes me how well it came out. And you know what else amazes me is just how much steel went into this pool. I mean, if they say the dig is the foundation, steel is the skeleton. And during this video, I'm gonna go over the engineering plan, what it means, and what to look for when you put steel in the ground before you shoot your gunite. So whether you are a DIYer like I am, or you're going through a traditional pool build, pay attention to this phase. Let's get into the steel. What you're seeing here is page 2 of the actual engineering plans for my pool. They were created by a licensed structural engineer and stamped for code compliance. That stamp signifies liability, safety, and approval for permits. And if you're in a DIY program like I am, these plans are given directly to you. But even if you're using a traditional pool builder, you still paid for these plans. They're submitted as part of the permit process. So don't be afraid to ask for a copy. These plans are your best tool to verify what's actually being built in your backyard. So yeah, if you're part of the DIY program, you're going to be able to go onto their website here and you're going to see some pretty spectacular stuff. And under the steel phase, that's the one area, I'll tell you, if I were to critique something, it would be that they didn't quite do as well as they could have in the steel part. But you do get some checklists and resources. They have a lot of different educational videos that talk about things to look at and what you can expect in the field day. But what you really need to know is, what the heck do all these terms really mean, and what do I look out for as a homeowner, especially if you were like me and you didn't have the county or the city coming in to inspect. And on page 3 of my plans, it gives you detailed instructions on exactly how the steel is supposed to be laid out, including bar size, spacing, placement, elevations. It's all there in black and white. But this isn't just for the crew, it's for you. And understanding your plans gives you the control you need. But a lot of this is like a foreign language. So what we're going to do in this video, we're going to break down each of these sections. Steel is the skeleton of your pool. And if you don't speak the language, it can feel overwhelming. You'll hear things like number 3 rebar, number 4 rebar, on center, lap splice, tie wire, and rebar chairs. But what do they actually mean? So let's start with the rebar sizes. There's number 3, number 4, number 5. Number 3 is 3/8 inch thick. Number 4 is 1/2 an inch thick, and number 5 is 5/8. It doesn't look like much, but you can see from the picture, it's a pretty big difference. In fact, on my engineering design, or engineering plans, it called for number 3 rebar. But the builder or the steel installer I had, he preferred to use number 4. And you can see even in the plans, it states number 4 is appropriate, and it counts for 2 bars of number 3. So when it comes to spacing or the separation of the bars in a grid pattern, they refer to that as on center. So you'll see in the plans a number rebar and the measurement OC or on center. So typically from DIY pools and spas, you'll get engineering plans that'll call for number 3 rebar, 12 inches OC. That means they're spread apart 12 inches. Now my particular installer, he preferred number 4 at 10 inches. So you get a much more rigid pool because you got the bigger rebar and a smaller on center. So another thing you'll see on the plans is each direction, or sometimes each way, depending on how your engineer does it. And what that means is it's going on center left to right and forward to back to form that grid pattern. So now you know what on center is. The next thing you need to understand is rebar lap splice. And it's the way they kind of overlap 2 pieces of rebar so that it acts like one rebar. And that overlap area is called the splice, and concrete grips both bars, and therefore the splice transfers force between them so that the structure stays strong. Now in our plan, it calls for a 24-inch overlap on all the splices, or a 24-inch lap. So the next thing to understand is something called rebar chairing. And that's where you lift the rebar up off the surface and away from the walls in order for there to be enough space to get the gunite or shotcrete back there between the ground and the rebar and then the surface of the pool. So rebar chairing can actually be done with specialized rebar chairs, but in pools they usually they use something called a doobie or dobby, and it's essentially blocks that they'll place under the rebar to lift up the rebar and then in between the walls and the rebar so that the rebar doesn't go against the wall when they're shooting that gunite in there. Okay, tie wires. Tie wires are essentially small pieces of wire that they twist around the rebars so that holds it in place. So it's not structural at all. So the most important thing to understand is that all your tie wire ties must be pointed down away from the interior surface of your pool. So what will happen is, if they're pointed up, they could be close enough to the surface to start rusting, and that rust will come through your pool plaster. So one thing for you to look at, make sure you go around and look at all your ties and make sure that they're pointed away from the surface of the pool. This, as you look at this big engineering drawing, there's a lot of stuff here, and basically it talks about each part of the pool. And so we know here the floor is going to be number 3, 12 on center, transitioning to number 3, 12 on center at the bottom, but then they're going to put in a more tighter area here, but on the floor it needs to be at least 6 inches thick of shotcrete or gunite. All of this information, but what's key, there's a couple things here. So here they tell you, based on the depth of your pool, which table to use, and you have them over here. So under table 1, A, B, C, and D, for my particular pool build, they're using number 1. So it calls for 3 bars across the bond beam, meaning the top of the wall, and 6 inches between the last bar and the one that starts the top of the bond. Now, for me, we were using number 4 bars, so they actually only used 2 bars up here, so it ended up being 1, 2, and 3, and you can see that in the photo. But what else is here? So you got the minimum pressure rated for the concrete, but if you look down, what is the C is the minimum amount of concrete that must be on each side of the bar. So your rebar needs to have 3 inches of concrete at 3 foot depth. It needs to be 3 inches on one side of the bar, 3 inches on the other. But as your pool gets deeper, you see you need more concrete. And so, like my pool is 8.5, actually it's 9.5 feet deep. We had 9 inches of concrete. I actually, my gunite crew was great, and they sprayed 12 inches of concrete. But I had to make sure that my rebar guy understood that. So he had placed the rebar in a way that 6 inches of concrete could get behind the rebar. And then the other thing on this chart is the R. R is the radius, as you see here. And so you don't want a pool to come down and turn, right? So you want the pool to have a radius to it, and off the radial point, that tells you, depending on how deep the pool is how much the radius has to be. So if you go down to the deeper pools, you're going to see more of a curve on the bottom of the pool, whereas at the shallow end of the pool, it's going to be a pretty tight radius of 1 inch, or 1 foot. So it's going to be a pretty quick radius. But on the deep end, it's going to be a really shallow radius. And it's kind of an interesting optical effect because my drains, because of this long radius, actually look like they're right next to the wall. But this big radius makes the wall look like it starts sooner than it really does. Other things on here that you'll see, raised bond beams or standard wall beams. And then they got the beach entry shelf. I didn't have a beach entry. I did have a shallow shelf, so that played into it on how that was created. And then the big one here. So if you have any kind of dam, if you have a spa that overflows, you're going to have what's called a dam, and that's what this construction looks like here. And I can show you on one of the pictures and videos what it looks like. And I actually had a reverse, or I had an infinity edge on mine, so one of these bars ends up being higher just to create that infinity edge. But again, number 3 bar 12 inches on center. My guy did number 4 bars at 10 inches on center. And then he also, on the inside of the pool, he actually super reinforced the middle part of the pool. As you can see here, there's a big, it's like he doubled up the bars going down as the pool dropped into the deep end. So that was really nice. And then the other thing you'll want to look at as you're seeing your steel built out is you want to look at the skimmer box and make sure it's properly steeled out, because they're going to need to put, that's going to get filled with concrete. It's going to be essentially create a box. Your plumber will first come in and put the skimmer box in there, but they'll fill it with concrete. And then if you're having a niche, a light niche, I went with nicheless lights, so I didn't have to worry about that at all. And then the funny thing is, if you look at my pool, we actually had to convert to a freestanding pool wall because we had to do that overbuild. And so that's where you'll see this kind of construction piece to it. And they did all that, and they actually put up some supporting mechanisms behind it. But this is pretty intense, pretty exhaustive list of stuff. If you see anything in here that you're not really familiar with, just drop a line or drop a comment down below, and I'll see if I can find out what the answer is for you. DIY does a great job answering questions. The community there, they usually will come in pretty quick too, but the owners of the company, they'll spend hours with you just talking about what does this really mean. Like keeping concrete damp continuous for 14 days. That's in the next phase. We'll get into that more so after we talk about plumbing. But really, it's pretty exhaustive what you got to look at here. And then this is kind of a overview of the entire pool, right? So it really talks about all of the generic kind of stuff in your pool. So, like I said, if you have any questions or any kind of concerns, just drop a comment down below. I'll get to them right away. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and follow along on this crazy playlist. We're going to be heading into plumbing next. All right. Thanks again.